Pastor Ed here with our weekly devotion for Thursday, August the 20th. We're wrapping up. We wrapped up this past Sunday our 6-week series on the book of Revelation. So now kind of going to wrap it up this week for the weekly devotion is to kind of pull everything together. There's so much there. I mean, even in 6 weeks, I hardly scratched the surface. But there's so many misconceptions about the book of Revelation out there. I hope I was able to dispel at least some of them. I want to start with a story. A pastor was once trying to teach a Sunday school class about how to be saved. And he said, if I sold everything I have and I gave it to the church, would I go to heaven? And the children said, no. And he said, very good, that's right. And if I worked hard at keeping all the 10 commandments, would that get me to heaven? And the kids said, no. And the pastor said, very good, that's right. If I was baptized, would that get me to heaven? Again, the kids said, no. Pastor replied, very good. If I repented of my sins and I believed that Jesus died for me and asked him to save me, would I go to heaven? And the kids, to the pastor's surprise, answered, no, no. Said the disappointed pastor, then what would I have to do to go to heaven? And the kids answered, die. I think I've told that one before, but it just kind of tickles my fancy every time. Bishop Fulton Sheen, he was, I think he was on the radio and so forth, maybe even a little bit before my time or when I was young. But in his autobiography that was entitled Treasure in Clay, he wrote about an experience that he once had when he was traveling around preaching. He said, I stopped to ask a few boys for directions to the town hall where I was giving a lecture. And they told me where the town hall was, and it then asked, well, what are you going to do there? And he said, well, I'm going to give a lecture on heaven and how to get there. Would you like to come and find out? And the one boy said, you got to be kidding me. You don't even know the way to get to town hall. Book of Revelation is a misunderstood book. There's so many things out there, and what I don't know about you, but what I associate with it so often is the idea of the end times and what's going to happen and predicting. You know, there's so many that use Revelation and the book of Daniel and some other passages here and there that they kind of pluck out and put together a scenario for saying, oh, this is when it's going to be. So if I were to say to you, what do the years 1248, 1306, 1689, 1792, 1836, 1844, 1914, 1936, 1960, 1974, 1981, 1988, 1989, 1992, 1994, and 2011 all have in common? Well, the answer is they all represent times that people predicted that the end would come, the second coming of Christ would occur. But of course, Jesus was very clear in the Gospels that no one will know that. He won't even know the day or the hour. But what we do know is that Christ's coming, therefore, is going to be unexpected and dramatic. 2 Peter 3:10 says, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. And of course, that adds, I think, to the whole idea of the end times being a destruction, which, again, is not so much how, when you take the grand scheme of things, and especially the book of Revelation itself, what we heard this past week is that there would be a new heavens and a new earth. It's not about burning down everything that there is, but renewing and recreating, almost like a second paradise, like in the book of Genesis at the very beginning. And it kind of beginning in the first book of the Bible, the last book of the Bible begins with a garden, ends with even in Revelation 22, as we heard, talking about a garden. But I took a little bit of time and, to look at, here's a quote, the last days are upon us. Weigh carefully the times. Look for him who's above all time, eternal and invisible. That wasn't modern prophecy. That was made by a Christian named Ignatius, who lived in AD 110. Another quote, there's no doubt that the Antichrist has already been born, firmly established in his early years. He will, after reaching maturity, achieve supreme power. Well, that wasn't made by somebody in our time, but it was written by actually a Christian leader named Martin, living in 375 AD. In 236 AD, a church leader named Hippolytus predicted that Christ was sure to be returned by 500 AD. The years between 999 and 1030 were characterized by excessive speculation about Christ's second coming among Christians, so much so that apparently it led to chaos as farmers didn't plant crops for the next year, buildings weren't repaired, the details of daily life were neglected because why? They all thought that Christ was coming in their lifetime, in the next few years. In the 1500s, even Martin Luther said, we have reached the time of the white horse of the apocalypse. The world will not last any longer than maybe another 100 years. Christopher Columbus said that he was sure that the world would end by 1656. And the year 1666 saw an explosion in end-time speculation, so much so that one pastor wrote in his journal that every time a storm hit, people would go to church to await Christ's coming. In 1806, the news of Christ's return came by means of a hen in Leeds, England, who'd been laying eggs that had the message on them, Christ is coming. Of course, they ultimately figured out that somebody was writing that on the eggs. In the 1800s, a Christian named William Miller said, I'm fully convinced that somewhere between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844, Christ will come again. And when those dates came and went, hundreds of people, abandoned him and the faith. If he was wrong about that, what else was he wrong about? The preacher Samuel Snow predicted Jesus would return on 1844, October 22nd. Thousands of people gave away their possessions, only to be surprised when the world, in fact, did not end. A prophecy teacher by the name of Michael Baxter of England pinpointed the arrival of Christ's return as being March 12th, 1903, actually between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. Moving forward in history, Dorothy Martin, a Chicago housewife, predicted that the end would come on December 21st, 1954. Pat Robertson, on a broadcast of the 700 Club, said, I guarantee you by October, November of 1982, there's going to be judgment on the world. And he later acknowledged, of course, when it didn't happen, that I have a relatively good track record, but sometimes I miss. A retired NASA scientist by the name of Edgar Weisenhout published a book entitled 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. Book sold more than 4 million copies in just a few months, was the center of much discussion until October 11th came and went, with nothing happened. He later printed a modified edition of his booklet a few years later, in which he discussed a few errors that he'd possibly been made in his calculations. In 1992, there was a book written by Harold Camping entitled 1994, again, another date. 1993, he wrote another book, much more evidence that 1994 could be the end of the world. Well, 1994, of course, came and went. And in his 1996 book, The Planet Earth 2000 AD, Hal Lindsey, and I remember this when I was in college, he'd been predicting end times since his 1970 best-selling book, The Late Great Planet Earth. Well, in 1996, he wrote that Christians should not make any plans after the year 2000. And here we are. People speculating, wondering, and Revelation gets kind of pulled into all of that. And, does Revelation say that there's going to be an end and something new emerging? Yes, it does. But does it say when that's going to be? No, it doesn't. In fact, scholars have said that we often read it as a prediction of events to come, and yet the accepted definition of apocalyptic literature, which Revelation is an example, describes books like Revelation as drawing on as being revealing rather than predictive. That's what revelation means, of course. In other words, the vision that John, the seer, describes in those verses is not a view of the future from a crystal ball, but instead John's vision lets us see that God's home is among us without the veil of human destruction and violence. The first things will have passed away, and the new things, a new heaven and a new earth, will emerge. There's a story that comes from the Civil War. General Sherman was leading his Northern Army on a path from Chattanooga down to Atlanta and on to the ocean. He was burning everything in his path, and in time he was involved in a strategic battle at Fort Altoona. And the Confederates, under the leadership of Captain Hood, knew that the North would receive new supplies at Fort Altoona in order to continue their march past Atlanta into the sea. So the Confederates attacked Fort Altoona, and as the battle raged, General Sherman was on a nearby mountain with field glasses watching the scene. Message from inside the fort was received that more men and supplies were desperately needed, so they were supplied, and the battle for the fort continued. And as the battle raged, the captain inside the fort received a message from a reflective mirror on top of the mountain. General Sherman was saying, "Inside, hold the fort, for I am coming." That's the message of Revelation. Hold the fort, hang in there. It's a word of comfort, a word of hope, a word of promise that God has not forgotten us despite what we see all around us, and that evil, despite its prevalence, does not have the final word. Someone wrote this little piece that I'd like to close with. He said, "Heaven is a land without tears or sadness. You'll find no crying there. Heaven is a land without funerals. You'll find no dying there. Heaven is a land without broken hearts. You'll find no regrets there. Heaven is a land without agony. You'll find no sorrow there. Heaven is a land without offenders. You'll find no prisons there. Heaven is a land without the tempter. You'll find no evil there. Heaven is a place without sad partings. You'll find no goodbyes there. Heaven is a land of eternal bliss. You will find King Jesus there." And of course, in Revelation 21, we read, "And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And he that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said unto me, Write, for these words are true and faithful." That's the message of Revelation. That's the word of hope and promise. And that's the word that allows us to continue on even through the most difficult times in our world and in our individual lives. Cling fast to those promises and to those assurances and to your faith. Well, I hope you're having a pretty good week, maybe a great week, and look forward to seeing you on Sunday or you joining us remotely. We're going to have a 2-week little mini-series on the book of Esther, which is an interesting book of the Bible, only book of the Bible in which the name of God is not mentioned. So if you want to hear more about that, join us for worship on Sunday morning at 9:30, or tune in to our live stream or the recordings, that you can access at the website. Until then, take care. Have a good week. Bye-bye.